a large proportion of the spend is on people. You have very limited amount of money to actually spend on, other like flights or hotels or whatever. And so maybe that's kind of interesting. Obviously, the revenue part I found quite interesting as well. But in terms of the granularity of data, I mean, there's this discussion on Twitter, about whether it's interested, whether somebody should be trying to analyze whether the organization has an excessive consumption of milk or not. And of course, it's not my that's sort of, I guess, my main focus of interest, I guess. But there could be legitimate questions on, is this organization splurging on flights or hotels, whatever? And when you look at the aggregate costs, I mean, you can see actually, sorry, the table. It's not very much money anyway that's being on these kinds of things. But if you look, for example, flights were £18,000 last year. You don't really know if that was justifiable or not unless you can actually see some more detail of what that actually looks like. And I think in some ways, unless you really see the actual flights, like were they business class or economy, for example. The one thing I wanted to say is the sort of real world application or relevance of this maybe is in lots of countries there's a real strong demand for a much more detailed breakdown of what exactly donors are spending money on. So not just that they're giving X amount of money to the country, but how much of that is basically going back to the donor country in consultancy costs. How much of that is actually on buying capital invest on the ground, on buying cars for maybe for the government or for other NGO or whatever. And so there is a legitimate interest in having more detailed data. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily need to be granular or detailed as this, but that's part of the reason why I made this to kind of be to kind of present sort of the sort of most radical, hopefully, end point of that, and say at what point before that do we think we should be stopping? So, yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
So it was a bit longer than 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Great.
Questions from anybody? First of all?
Yes. Mark, this is great. I missed the first bit. What data based on? Is this sort of just test data or is this real data?
It's real data. So, since about 2014, I guess, Public Fund's been publishing this very detailed financial data.
Oh, so it's what you fund data.
Yeah, exactly. So this is Publish What You Fund's the organisation data. It's been published very, very detailed since then, but basically there hasn't really been a way to actually look at that since then. So, I mean, I think there's also kind of an interesting. I did run this by them. Obviously they're not accountable for this or whatever, but I did check that they were kind of more or less okay with this beforehand. And I think there's a kind of interesting point also about the decision of publishing the data itself. Of course, it's kind of organization sign off or whatever. But then turning that data from this very granular stuff to something that's actually much more easy to access. It does change maybe in some way that the balance in terms of whether this is kind of a good idea to publish or scary or confidential or whatever this kind of stuff. Because if no one can really see it, then maybe it matters a bit less. But if this data then is much more easily accessible through this kind of visualization, then there's some more reflections also there on what's the appropriate balance of disclosure, I guess.
My other question is, was in the Grand Bargain we have one of the work streams is management costs, and we looked at it in terms of thinking of doing some prototyping.
Yeah.
I did not to for whatever. And we'd previously spoken to them, and I'd said to them, you can do this stuff in IATI, this sort of stuff. And they said, I know that's very interesting, but I know they don't have the skills in that work stream. But I'm thinking this could be really interesting to them to actually see it, because the whole reason we're doing the prototyping, as we were discussing in Copenhagen, because when you talk about it, people don't understand. But if you show them something like this and they think, God, shit, get that from IATI data, they become really interested.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether, I don't know whether you'd be interested, or maybe think about hooking you up with the management cost people or whatever.
Sure.
And I mean, I'm conscious if you're doing it in your own time or whatever. In terms of just to show what's available. And I mean, not only that, it fits under our sort of prototyping remit anyway. So,
I mean, I think that's a really, there's two thoughts on this. Firstly, I mean, obviously this kind of data is not generally available in IATI. It's only really from Publish What You Fund that has this detailed, granular breakdown.
But it could be, couldn't it? That's the point.
Exactly, it could be. Yeah. And, you know, there were some debates on Twitter about whether it should be or not. I mean, from my perspective, I don't really see why this granularity of data would be a problem, you know. Of course, like, to the extent that you have satisfied concerns around harm or confidentiality or whatever, you know. In the case of Publish What You Fund, I think when we published this data, it wasn't very tough, you know, it's sort of discussion to think like what sort of things we should or shouldn't be publishing, because we weren't really doing that kind of very sensitive work, you know. But maybe for larger organizations it becomes more of a concern. The second thing is, in terms of like management costs, you know, for example, or any of these kinds of like buckets of, you know, aggregate, you know, definitions of sets of things, whatever, I think it probably can be quite hard to have like a consistent definition of what that actually means.
I was going to say they're struggling with that.
Yeah, exactly. And like and also then to be able to get out of your financial system in a way that, you know, maps to that kind of definition, you know. And so one answer is like, you know, you publish very detailed data and then people can decide which, you know, budget lines they think are actually relevant or not. And you know, like I think there's a practical application. For example, you know, like in with large donor projects, you know, when they send donor staff to the country and they pay, you know, per diems and maybe business class flights, all this kind of stuff. And which, you know, may be entirely legitimate or maybe something that people would like to debate or the government would like to, you know, have a discussion about or whatever. You can only really do that if you do have quite granular data. And it doesn't necessarily need to be as granular as this, but it probably does need to be quite a lot more granular than the sort of data that you get at the moment from some organizations.
Can I make a point? So,
yeah.
I think without fail, every organization that I work with who are publishing IATI data are shocked that the IATI is to not have some form of granularity, particularly on expense.
Yeah.
You can't say, yeah, expenses is just a quarterly aggregate of what you spent.
Yeah.
Not even broken down by staff and travel. No, the gist is not that.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important discussion to have because we haven't got any clarity or any discussion on what is useful. So this, I think your point, Mark, is an extreme example is really helpful.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's really valuable. There's I've seen now, you know, in ePortal, you know the ePortal,
Yeah.
and the graphs.
Yeah.
And if you make a commitment in the graph for 2 months and then your expenditure and your disbursements, so the idea seems that the graph should meet and everything should balance out, or is it? That's what I'm trying to understand. So this visualization is a nice way to challenge some of that, is that because management fees and payment by result profits don't, in some instances, don't mean that the graph will never balance out unless you move money into a different category, which is a way of balancing.
Yeah.
So I don't know, the graphs, we've seen these graphs before, and I think that the default is interesting about that, but that's on a project basis. And you're talking, I think, of an organisation, but nevertheless, what do we expect? Like your troughs, are that what we expect, or do we on a project expect to see a line of income and expenditure?
Yeah.
It's actually not an accounting system. We should ignore all this, and then what's the point of doing it?
Just to...
And that's it. Oh, sorry, Wendy, go ahead. Yeah, Wendy, go ahead.
They're all questions.
That's right. I was just going to say, I just wanted to those points, Stephen. I know that the management costs work stream in the Grand Bargain, they were trying to come up with a definitive set of expense categories. But for all the reasons you mentioned, the issue is it's not about the technology, because as Mark has shown, we can do it. It's about how they do their accounting internally. A lot of organisations are terrified about putting this information out, as you mentioned, or whatever. So it's more about the sort of business process and the business rules things. But I think what this demonstrates, which I really like, is it's like with our prototyping work, we're trying to show the art of what is possible, and actually, this is again maybe an aspiration. We're not going to get there today or tomorrow, but actually if we don't ask for it, will never get it. So I really like it in that respect. And in regards to the accounting system, we very much work on the premise, is it good enough? So working with the organisations we've been working with, it's a case that when they say accounting systems, everything has to balance. They well, not necessarily, because you've got exchange rates and everything. But actually, it just needs to be good enough to tell the story. And actually, that puts the onus where it needs to be, back on the publisher to take ownership and validate the data that they're putting out there. So it is telling the story that they want to tell. So I think we need to sometimes reflect that back to the organisations that publish, that it's their responsibility, not IATI's or anything else's.
Yeah. Just one thing on the accounting stuff. Like, I mean, yeah, there's this long-running, axiom or something, or a statement, I guess, in IATI. IATI is not an accounting system, and for me, I've never really quite understood what is necessarily meant by that, apart from the fact that the data isn't, as granular as you would find in an accounting system. Because actually, most of the time, the data in IATI, it is being fed by accounting systems, and maybe, it's not all of the granularity that you get there, but it is from the accounting system. And there are some certain use cases or some cases where you can see actually having that granularity of data, and it clearly does make the data more used for particular use cases, It doesn't necessarily mean that in every context it's the right thing to do, but there is some interesting discussion, I think, to be had, and why shouldn't why shouldn't you just publish your account? And of course there are concerns about harm and confidentiality and stuff like that. You do need to kind of consider, but yeah, I mean, pushing somehow in this direction, maybe it's interesting.
I think the reality is, though, Mark, people hide from that a lot of the time because either they haven't done the work, or, as I say, for whatever reason. The big thing about IATI is not IATI, it's the fact that they've got to move from a position, isn't it, where they've been able to work behind closed doors with nobody asking questions. Changing that culture has to come from the top. And I think a lot of the time we get people saying, oh, we can't do that, it's right, but actually it's because, it's coming from a position of fear, I think, that fear of being exposed, of, people questioning when they haven't had that before.
But the question of granularity also applies to the activity, the units of aid. You could have 1,000 activities that mean nothing, or one activity that means a lot. For me, it's the granularity question to Mark. You're painting a picture that we should discuss in public. Are you going to write a discuss post, or have you already?
I haven't, but maybe I'll write a blog or something, I don't know.